In this lecture, we're going to go over the chapter on air pollution, chapter 18 from Living in the Environment, which is the second half of our Unit 7 material. So the chapter starts out by looking at layers of the atmosphere, which is something you should remember from the first semester, but not all students do, so we like to review it, keeping in mind that most of the air pollutants that we're going to be talking about are found in the troposphere. We will differentiate between ozone found in the stratosphere and ozone found in the troposphere, and students often get these mixed up, so make sure you know the difference between the two. And we'll talk a little bit about some air pollutants that will alter the stratosphere and the ozone layer later in this year, but that's something to keep in mind. So greenhouse gases and all of the air pollutants that we really want to focus on for this chapter are going to be found in the troposphere. The stratosphere is that second layer of the atmosphere that has very low water vapor, but it has a high concentration of ozone. So I want to differentiate between stratospheric ozone and surface ozone. So stratospheric ozone is really important. It is going to absorb a lot of the UV radiation that comes into the top of Earth's atmosphere and act as basically a global sunscreen. And it's produced by a specific reaction when UV radiation breaks apart oxygen, and oxygen reforms as ozone, or O3. We'll talk later this year about chlorofluorocarbons, which are CFCs, and deplete ozone. But for the scope of this unit, please make sure that you know that ozone at the tropospheric level, the lowest layer, the ozone at the surface level, is harmful to humans, whereas ozone in the stratosphere is helpful to humans. It blocks UV radiation. So that differentiation is important for students to understand at the beginning of this unit and before we get into our unit on global change, which we'll end the year with. Atmospheric pollution comes in basically the presence of any chemical in concentrations high enough to alter climate, harm organisms, harm ecosystems, or even break down man-made materials. And we have plenty of natural sources of atmospheric pollution. These can come from lightning, reactions associated with lightning. These can come from volcanic emissions, from wildfire emissions. These can come from material off forests. So this can come from dust storms. There are natural sources of air pollutants, and there are natural sources of materials in our atmosphere. But since human activities have started, pollution emissions are much higher than they would be naturally. And so we see primary pollutants come from many different man-made activities. Wastes from cities, waste from agriculture, waste from industry, waste from transportation. Anything that is small enough to be aerosoled or comes out in gas form is going to be considered a primary pollutant, so a substance that is emitted directly into Earth's atmosphere. And we can see the classes of primary pollutants. We're going to talk about that in class, and we're going to talk about it here. Primary pollutants include carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, so any of the carbon oxides, sulfur dioxide, so any of the sulfur oxides. They also include nitrogen oxide and nitrogen dioxide. We also see hydrocarbons, suspended particulates, etc., associated with primary pollutants. During their time in the atmosphere, these pollutants can undergo a series of chemical reactions, and these reactions can be driven by exposure to sunlight, exposure to other chemicals, exposure to water vapor, exposure to oxygen, etc. These reactions are going to create a series of secondary pollutants: sulfur trioxide, ozone, PANS, VOX, sulfuric acids, nitrogen acids. There's a lot of different secondary pollutants, and I'm going to go over them in just a second. But essentially, these are any harmful substances in our atmosphere that are associated with a chemical reaction after a primary pollutant has been emitted and undergoes a reaction associated with exposure to radiation, UV, sunlight, etc., or to other chemicals it meets in the atmosphere like water vapor, oxygen, etc. So the major air pollutants that are going to be identified are going to fall into these categories. So we've identified some of the carbon oxides. We certainly know that carbon monoxide is highly toxic, and it forms during sort of an incomplete combustion of fossil fuels, wood, basically any carbon-containing material. Carbon dioxide is certainly a huge player in its effect on the carbon cycle, and we see a significant amount of it being put into the air from human activities, mostly from the burning of fossil fuels, but also from deforestation. As of today, carbon dioxide is not actually a pollutant regulated by the U.S. Clean Air Act, although there are some emissions regulations that are associated with other policies from either the EPA or state-based policies that we'll talk about. Nitrogen oxides and nitric acid. So when nitrogen oxide forms, basically there's going to be issues associated with it. So we form nitrogen oxides from mostly transportation combustions. Some can come from industries such as coal burning power plants. There's also natural ways in which nitrogen oxides form. In the atmosphere, when you have NO2, it's going to react with water vapor in the air to form nitric acid, which can contribute to acid deposition. It can also form nitrates, which can come and deposit themselves out of the air and cause harm or increase the number of ions in different ecosystems around the world. We'll talk more about that reaction when we get to our acid rain lab. Sulfur dioxide does much the same thing. So most of the sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere is actually coming from human sources. Only about a third is actually existing naturally due to the sulfur cycle. But combustion of coal, so the burning of coal, is going to significantly increase the amount of sulfur dioxides in our atmosphere. We also find that associated with some smelting of different metals, materials, etc. We're going to study a case study later in this unit that specifically highlights this particular issue. In the atmosphere, the sulfur dioxide is going to undergo a series of chemical reactions that create secondary pollutants such as sulfuric acid, H2SO4, and sulfate salts. And these are going to play a significant role in acid deposition as well. So when we do our acid rain lab, we're going to actually talk about sulfur dioxide, how it creates sulfuric acids in our atmosphere, and what effect those acids are going to have on ecosystems and man-made materials. Another major air pollutant is particulates. Particulates are any solid or liquid droplets that are small and light enough to remain in the air for a significant amount of time. We sometimes refer to these as aerosol materials. But they can be harmful to human health because they are quite small. The EPA lists particulate material from average size of about 10 microns to 2.5 microns, which is considered fine, to 0.1 microns, which is considered ultrafine. And these suspended particulates are responsible for a significant portion of premature deaths around the world. And when we, let's say, don a mask that is N95 rated, we're basically trying to block out particulates of this size. So during our wildfire seasons, this is something that we want to make sure we're not inhaling too much of. People who live near major areas of industry or transportation over their lives are going to inhale more of these particulates than other people. And so there's a pretty significant environmental justice issue associated with high concentrations of particulate matter. Ozone is the gas that we talked about, and in the stratosphere it's good, but in the troposphere it's bad. It is actually a secondary pollutant that comes from reactions associated with photochemical smog, which we'll talk about in just a second, and it can cause serious respiratory issues. It can lead to heart disease, it damages plants, it damages man-made materials, and you can actually smell ozone. Usually when you're standing close to train tracks or some other transportation, we tend to smell ozone. It's more prominent in the summertime, but it's there and it's problematic. VOCs are volatile organic compounds, hydrocarbons emitted by plants. Methane would be an example of this. But right now, most of the methane being emitted is from human sources. And these VOCs have problems because often they're either going to get into the system and do damage, or they have some sort of long-term effects, like a benzene, for example. Once it enters into the body, it might stay because we don't have a lot of enzymes that break it down, and it can cause a significant number of issues in different parts of the body. And then finally, the other major air pollutant that we worry about is an indoor pollutant called radon. This is a naturally occurring pollutant that's found in our soils and our rocks. And it can seep into the basements of homes and buildings, and it's radioactive, so it's going to cause issues associated with exposure to radiation. I wanted to sort of point out the differences between particulate matter. Inhalable particles are basically anything PM10 and under, and they're going to pass basically through the respiratory system. Most of our respiratory system is lined with very, very small cilia, or hair-like materials on the ends of our cells, and they can trap some PM10 or larger particles. But if you have a PM 2.5 or even a PM of 1, these are going to pass deep into the lung, settle in the alveoli of the lung, or even actually cross the cells into the circulatory system and get into our bodies. And this is certainly problematic, which is why we wear masks. Masks are going to be able to block some of these particulates. N95s typically focus on blocking 0.3 micron particles or smaller, or larger. And so they are capable of filtering out basically all types of particles except perhaps the ultrafine. They don't do as well with. Coronavirus is about 0.1 micrometers, so N95s do help with it, but they're not 100% effective, interestingly enough. One of the case studies highlighted in your text is atmospheric brown clouds. These are massive, in other words, they can be seen from space during certain seasons, and they're caused by different types of smog or air pollution. They're usually made up of dust, smoke, ash, and they come from vehicle exhaust, they come from the burning of coal, they come from industry emissions. We see them most of the year, but they often will be associated more in summertime. They're associated with higher travel, they're associated with higher food production. They're really dependent on weather patterns. Their longevity can be limited if you have a lot of weather that's going to clear them away. But the solution overall is less coal burning and less transportation associated with burning of fossil fuels. So smog comes in two types. So we would associate these brown clouds with smogs. And industrial smog is going to be a mixture of sulfur dioxide, sulfuric acid, and suspended particulates, basically soot or ash that comes out of the burning of primarily coal. So in industrial smog, carbon and coal is going to combust. If it partially combusts, it creates carbon monoxide. If it fully combusts, it creates carbon dioxide. And so that's going to be a significant portion of industrial smog. Sulfur in coal and in oil is going to combust and create sulfur dioxide. When this interacts with oxygen, we're going to create sulfur trioxides. When it interacts with water vapor in the atmosphere, we create a sulfuric acid. And if it interacts with ammonia, we create basically an ammonium sulfate. And these materials are going to contribute to acid deposition. Developed countries typically have some pollution control, so we can try to control at the top of smokestacks basically how much of this material we're releasing. We also will tend to build taller smokestacks to sort of push the material higher into the atmosphere and away from the location where it is burning. But we still see industrial smog associated with industrialized regions here in the United States, and certainly in a lot of developing nations where coal burning is still really important. We'll talk about a case study associated with basically deadly industrial smog at the surface level. Photochemical smog is probably the smog you're more familiar with living here in California, and that's due to the fact that it's associated with the nitrogen content of our fossil fuels. So natural gas, but mostly gasoline and other petroleum-based products are going to contain some amount of nitrogen. And when we burn those fossil fuels, they interact with oxygen to create these nitric oxides. That can interact with oxygen further to create nitrogen dioxide. This can interact with both UV radiation, sunlight, and water vapor to basically split that nitrogen dioxide back into oxygen atoms and nitric oxides. Those free oxygen atoms can interact with regular oxygen and create ozone, and this is where we get surface level and dangerous ozone. And then ozone can react with other volatile organic compounds in the atmosphere to create things like PANs or other pollutants. PANs are peroxysyl, I can't even look at the word before I say it, peroxysyl nitrates, and they're associated with basically some respiratory issues as well. So these mixture of pollutants that are coming out of the nitrogens burned in fossil fuels create what we call photochemical smog. And we're usually going to see these over cities. They tend to be worse during hot days because we have higher UV radiation during those days. And if you go to LA, if you go to New York, even over our urban area, you'll see these smog days where this sort of haze sits over the city, and it's associated with photochemical smog. So here's some pictures to show you, usually industrial smog we can see very specifically associated with a point source, so a specific smokestack. Photochemical smog, on the other hand, tends not to have any point sources and is sort of found just in the air from all of the activities that are going on and all of the transportation that is happening. It's a nice picture to sort of show all of the things that can go on, all of the issues that can happen. Again, most of what's happening is down in the troposphere, but we do see things like CFCs that enter into the stratosphere and cause problems. I would spend some time observing this image, trying to understand it. This is a great representing information question or image to sort of talk about how material moves into the atmosphere. Once it's in this atmosphere, what happens to it and where does it go? Eventually, most of it will come back to the surface. No matter where it's carried, it comes back to the surface eventually. And so we tend to see deposition associated with nearby industry. Lead is associated with the burning of fossil fuels pre-unleaded gas. So as a pollutant, lead has been found in air, water, soils, plants, animals, etc. It doesn't break down in the environment because it's an atom, and it causes a significant amount of issues. It's a neurotoxin, it damages the neurosystem, it has a significant portion of effects on both adults but mostly children. And we still are treating children for lead poisoning here in the United States every year. This has dropped significantly since we phased out leaded gasoline. Here in the United States, that's not true for every country, but most countries have moved away from leaded gasoline. Unfortunately, lead-based paints are still significantly found throughout the United States, and children have been known to eat lead-based paint chips or just breathe in dust associated with the removal of lead paints, and that can be really, really significantly problematic. So in outdoor air pollution, air pollution is going to be reduced by the settling out of particulates and gases, and this can be induced by precipitation, by sea spray. Pollution can be moved from one area to the other by wind, and certainly we can eliminate primary pollutants through a series of chemical reactions. Where we see pollution increase is going to be associated with urban settings. So urban buildings, tall urban buildings will slow wind dispersal. Urban settings tend to be warmer, so they hold in some of that material. Mountains will also pose a problem because they create basically these valleys between them that induce temperature inversions. So what a temperature inversion is, or a thermal inversion is when you have warm air mass that sort of sits above a colder air mass, and the inversion layer is going to hold down that material into basically a tiny pocket at the surface. And we see this in LA, we see this in Mexico City. We're going to talk about an example of this associated with industrial smog during our case studies, this unit. But essentially, these thermal inversions are problematic because they prevent pollutants from leaving. And it's not until you get some sort of significant breeze event where you can actually move that sort of pocket of air pollutant away. We saw this last fall during the day where we had all of the smoke matter basically hovering over San Francisco and we couldn't see the sun for like 2 days. That was due to a thermal inversion that was holding all of that material, all of that wood burnt material from the wildfires in a cap sort of over the Bay Area. We're going to significantly talk about acid deposition in our lab this unit, but I wanted to sort of review it. That when we have these secondary particulates, they go up into the atmosphere, but eventually will settle back down. And so we have both dry deposition, where sulfur dioxide gases, particulates of the salts will actually settle down onto the surface, but we also have wet deposition. This is called acid rain, where the acids like sulfuric acid and nitric acid will be actually dissolved into rain or snow material and come to the surface associated with a precipitation event. And we see significant areas around the world associated with acid rain. Eastern United States, there's going to have a lot more problematic acid rain deposition. We'll see this in a minute. Across Europe, we see this, and in areas like the coal plants burning in China, we see this as well. So the effects of acid deposition are problematic. On man-made materials, they can damage statues, graves, buildings, because the acid will actually eat away at certain materials, and we'll talk about which materials erode the best or erode the fastest in our lab. This could leach toxic materials into nearby drinking water, so things like lead and mercury can end up in a reservoir or an aquifer as associated with acid rains and depositions. And they can even contaminate fishes in this water, which people should not eat if that fish has been exposed to high levels of lead and mercury. The aquatic ecosystems, and actually even the terrestrial ecosystems, are going to have significant effects. The pH of water is going to get altered and release things like ions, like aluminum ions, into waterways. These ions are problematic. They suffocate fish by basically causing mucuses to form on their gills. In the terrestrial sense, we see acidic soils that can reduce plant productivity and harm crops. We see plant nutrients be leached out of the soil. Calciums, magnesiums, etc. are not going to be as available, and they can cause tree death as associated with these harmful ions. So some prevention is to reduce coal use, to use natural gas, which doesn't contain as much sulfur or renewable energy, and have smokestacks that are going to be able to pull some of the primary pollutants before they can get into the atmosphere and create these secondary effects. And I just wanted to show this because I think it's an interesting graph or map that shows where most of the coal burning industry plants are in the United States and where most of the acid deposition is associated. So we see, significantly more acid rain or deposition in the eastern part of the United States, unsurprisingly associated with basically the coal burning regions, and that's a big problem. We don't spend as much time on indoor air pollution, but you certainly should. This is a great threat to human health. The EPA talks about dangers associated with indoor air pollution, tobacco smoke, formaldehyde, radon, fine particulates, and actually dust mites, which are gross to think about, but certainly exist and can cause respiratory issues in humans. There's a really good image in your text that highlights some sources for all sorts of different pollutants in the home. Ones to know are certainly tobacco smoke, asbestos, formaldehyde, lead, radon, etc. And so what are the effects? Well, your respiratory system, like I said, can protect you from air pollution by filtering out some of these particulates. Larger particulates are going to be trapped by these cilia, which line your epithelial cells and can actually grab onto particulates and trap them, and you're going to move them out of the respiratory system. So the cilia work together to actually move those materials up. When you sneeze, when you cough, you're actually expelling a lot of those trapped materials. But if you have a fine particulate or an ultrafine particulate, they can get deep into the alveoli and even enter into our bloodstream. And so air pollutants are associated with at least 2.5 million people per year. World Health Organization just came out to say that's even higher. And we're still learning about the health effects of air pollutants. In the United States, the Clean Air Act in 1970, which has been revised multiple years, significantly reduced outdoor air pollution over these years. So we really focused on carbon monoxides, some nitrogen oxides, some sulfur dioxides, and some suspended particulate matters. Overall, we've seen mostly cleaner air since the Clean Air Act came out. Unfortunately, the car manufacturing lobby really prevented the Clean Air Act from acting on carbon dioxides and other sort of issues associated with the burning of fossil fuels for transportation. So we don't have any fuel efficiency standards for automobiles that was associated with the Clean Air Act. There has been other policies enacted since then that do focus on that. But you can sort of read some of the deficiencies. There's less prevention and more cleanup. There's not a lot of enforcement for companies that violate these things. But, there has been some significant effects. So here we see from 1970 to 2016, over time, particulate matters, for the most part, has dropped. VOx have dropped, sulfur dioxide has dropped, etc. So the Clean Air Act, has said, has had some really good effects. Read over the solutions to reducing air pollution. These shouldn't come really all that surprising about how we can reduce the amount of coal burning and other greenhouse gas emissions by reducing fossil fuels. We can reduce air pollutants through a significant number of practices. Make sure you spend some time reading over this slide or reading over the last section of the chapter, because it does a really good job of giving you some ideas for questions that come out of AP that are like, what is the solution to X? What is the solution to Z? And overall, if we can reduce air pollution, we're going to have a healthier community, we're going to have a more productive community, and we're not going to have as many taxes on our healthcare systems when it comes to clean air and the health issues that are associated with it.